He looked at her and decided, in less than a second, that she didn't belong there. But he had no idea he was about to humiliate the wrong woman. The first-class check-in area at JFK Airport glowed under sharp, white lighting, polished marble floors reflecting the movement of expensive luggage rolling smoothly across the surface, and the quiet hum of privilege filled the air as business travelers in tailored suits and luxury coats moved with practiced confidence, each step echoing a life of certainty and status. And then Emily Carter stepped forward, her worn sneakers barely making a sound, her denim jacket slightly faded at the sleeves, her small carry-on scuffed from years of use. And for a moment, everything around her seemed to pause, not because she demanded attention, but because she didn't match the picture of who was supposed to be there, and the agent behind the counter noticed immediately, his eyes flicking from her shoes to her bag, then back to her face, already forming a judgment before a single word was spoken. And when Emily gently placed her ticket on the counter, her voice calm and respectful, the agent didn't even reach for it right away, instead leaning back slightly with a faint smirk as he said, "Ma'am, are you sure you're in the right line?" And a couple nearby glanced over, curiosity sparked, the beginning of that subtle shift in the room where strangers become an audience. And Emily met his gaze without hesitation, her eyes steady. "Yes, I am," she replied quietly, but the agent chuckled under his breath, shaking his head as if amused by something only he could see, finally picking up her ticket but barely scanning it before placing it back down. "This check-in is for first-class passengers," he said, his tone polite on the surface but edged with something sharper underneath, something dismissive, and the words lingered just long enough for the people nearby to hear, for the silence to stretch, for the weight of it to settle, and one woman standing behind Emily shifted uncomfortably, while another man raised his eyebrows slightly, already forming his own silent conclusions, and Emily felt every pair of eyes without turning, without reacting, her posture still composed, her hands resting lightly on the handle of her bag, and for a brief second, something flickered in her expression, not embarrassment, not anger, but recognition. As if she had been here before, in moments just like this, where people saw only what they expected to see, and then dismissed everything else, and the agent leaned forward slightly now, lowering his voice just enough to sound controlled, but loud enough for others to catch. "Economy check-in is about 200 feet down that way," he added, gesturing casually over his shoulder, and a quiet ripple of laughter followed from somewhere behind. Not loud, not cruel, but enough to make the moment heavier, enough to make it real. And still, Emily didn't move. Her eyes remained calm, her breathing even, as she looked back at him and said, with quiet certainty that seemed almost out of place in a moment like this, "I do belong here." And that was when the atmosphere shifted again, subtle but undeniable, because confidence like that didn't fit the story they had already written about her. And for the first time, the agent hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before his expression hardened, preparing to push further, not knowing that in just a few moments, everything he thought he understood about this situation was about to collapse completely. The hesitation lasted less than a second, but in a place like this, even a second could change everything, and the agent quickly recovered, straightening his posture as his expression sharpened into something more rigid, more deliberate, as if he had just decided that this was no longer a misunderstanding but a line that needed to be enforced, and he tapped the counter lightly with 2 fingers, the sound crisp against the marble surface. "Ma'am, I need you to step aside so we can assist actual first-class passengers," he said, this time louder, more confident, his voice carrying just enough authority to draw even more attention. And now the silence around them was no longer neutral. It was charged, filled with expectation, with judgment, with that quiet anticipation people feel when they sense something uncomfortable unfolding. And Emily remained exactly where she was, her grip on the handle of her bag steady, her shoulders relaxed, her eyes never leaving his, and that stillness, that refusal to react the way he expected, seemed to irritate him more than anything else, because it disrupted the script he had already written in his mind. And behind her, a man in a tailored gray suit checked his watch impatiently, shifting his weight as if silently agreeing with the agent, while another traveler leaned slightly to get a better view, her phone already halfway raised, capturing the moment without saying a word, and the agent let out a short breath through his nose, turning slightly to the side as he signaled to a colleague. "Can you get a supervisor over here?" he called, not taking his eyes off Emily. And that was the moment the situation crossed a line, not because of what was said, but because of what it implied. And a low murmur spread through the nearby crowd, subtle but unmistakable, as people began forming opinions, choosing sides, deciding what kind of story this was going to be, and Emily could feel it, the weight of those assumptions pressing in from every direction. But she did not step back. She did not raise her voice. Instead, she simply reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out her phone, glancing at the screen for a brief moment before locking it again, as if confirming something only she understood. And when she looked back up, there was a quiet certainty in her expression that did not match the tension around her. And it was that certainty that made the agent frown slightly, just enough to betray a flicker of doubt before he quickly masked it again. And then the supervisor arrived, heels clicking sharply against the floor, her presence immediate and commanding, her uniform immaculate, her expression already set in professional concern. "What seems to be the issue?" she asked, her tone controlled. But the agent responded quickly, almost too quickly, eager to establish the narrative. "This passenger is refusing to move out of the first-class line," he said, gesturing subtly toward Emily. "And she does not appear to have a valid ticket for this area." And the supervisor turned her attention to Emily, her eyes scanning her appearance in the same quick, practiced way, taking in the jacket, the shoes, the bag, and in that brief glance, a decision seemed to form, not spoken, but understood, and she stepped closer, lowering her voice slightly, but not enough to make it private. "Ma'am, we need to keep this area clear for our premium travelers," she said, her words measured, rehearsed. "If you could please step aside, we will be happy to assist you at the appropriate counter." And for a moment, everything seemed to hold still again. The lights, the movement, the quiet hum of the terminal, all of it fading into the background as every eye remained fixed on Emily Carter, waiting to see what she would do next, unaware that the situation they believed they understood was already beginning to unravel. For a moment, it looked like she might step back, like she might quietly accept the path they had already chosen for her. But Emily Carter did not move, not even an inch, and that stillness began to shift the energy in the room in a way no one expected, because people were used to resistance being loud or emotional. But this was neither. This was something quieter, something steadier, and it made the situation feel less certain than it had just seconds ago, and the supervisor noticed it too, her eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to understand what she was missing, while the agent crossed his arms, leaning back with renewed confidence, convinced that the outcome was already decided. "Ma'am, this is your final notice," he said, his voice firm, measured, rehearsed. "If you do not step out of the line, we will have to involve airport security." And the word security landed heavily, not as a threat shouted in anger, but as a quiet escalation that everyone in the area understood. And a soft murmur rippled through the crowd again. A few people stepping slightly farther away as if distancing themselves from what might happen next, while others leaned in closer, drawn by the tension, their phones now more openly raised, capturing every second. And through all of it, Emily remained composed, her breathing slow, her expression calm, as if she were standing somewhere else entirely, somewhere untouched by the judgment surrounding her. And when she finally spoke, her voice was even, almost gentle. "I already checked in online," she said, "seat 2A. And the simplicity of the statement seemed to confuse the moment more than anything else, because it did not match the narrative they had built. And the agent let out a short, dismissive laugh, shaking his head as he glanced at the supervisor. "Right," he said, clearly unconvinced. "And I am the pilot flying this plane." And a few quiet chuckles followed. But this time they were less certain, less unified, as if doubt had begun to seep into the edges of the scene, and the supervisor extended her hand, her tone sharpening slightly. "May I see your boarding pass, please?" she said, and Emily nodded once, reaching into her bag with unhurried precision, pulling out a neatly folded document. And as she placed it on the counter, the room seemed to lean forward collectively, every eye drawn to that single piece of paper, and for a brief second, no one spoke, no one moved. And the supervisor picked it up, her gaze scanning the details. Quickly at first, then again more slowly, her expression shifting ever so slightly, a flicker of something uncertain crossing her face before she masked it. And the agent noticed, his confidence faltering just enough to be visible. "What is it?" he asked quietly, and the supervisor hesitated, just for a moment, before responding. "It says first class," she admitted, her voice lower now, more controlled. And the words hung in the air like a sudden drop in temperature, and the agent blinked, his eyes darting from the boarding pass to Emily, then back again, as if trying to reconcile two conflicting realities. And behind them, the crowd shifted once more, the tone no longer amused, no longer dismissive, but uncertain. And in that fragile silence, something changed, not completely, not yet, but enough to signal that the story they thought they were watching was not going to unfold the way they expected. And Emily Carter simply stood there, calm as ever, her eyes steady as the first. Cracks began to appear in the certainty that had surrounded her just moments before. The air shifted in a way no one could quite explain, subtle but undeniable, like the moment before a storm when everything feels too still. And the supervisor's fingers tightened slightly around the boarding pass as she read it again, slower this time, more carefully, as if hoping the details might change under closer inspection, but they did not. And the agent leaned in, his voice lower now, no longer carrying the same careless confidence. "There has to be a mistake," he muttered, almost to himself, but loud enough for those closest to hear. And the supervisor did not respond immediately, her eyes flicking from the printed seat number to Emily's face, then back again, searching for something that would restore the order she understood, and finding nothing. And behind them, the quiet murmurs grew, no longer amused, no longer dismissive, but curious, uncertain, and just a little uneasy, because the story they had been watching was beginning to break apart, and people do not like it when expectations collapse in real time. And Emily stood exactly as she had before, calm, composed, her expression unchanged, as if she had been here long enough to recognize the moment when doubt begins to replace certainty. And the agent straightened, clearing his throat as he tried to regain control. "We still need to verify this," he said, his tone more formal now, more cautious. "These kinds of errors do happen." And the words sounded weaker than he intended, because even he could hear the shift in his own voice. And the supervisor nodded quickly, almost relieved to have something procedural to hold on to, something that felt safe. "Yes, of course," she said, turning toward the terminal screen behind the counter, her fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced efficiency, pulling up the reservation system. And for a few seconds, the only sound was the soft tapping of keys and the distant hum of the terminal, and the crowd leaned in without realizing it, drawn into the silence, waiting, watching. And then the supervisor froze, not dramatically, not with any visible shock, but with a stillness that spoke louder than any reaction. And the agent noticed immediately, his voice tightening. "What does it say?" he asked, and she hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before answering. "The ticket is confirmed," she said quietly. "Full fare first class." And the words seemed to settle over the space like a weight, pressing down on every assumption that had been made just moments before. And the agent blinked, his expression faltering, the confidence draining from his posture as he looked at Emily again, really looked at her this time, as if trying to understand how he had gotten it so wrong. And behind them, the energy in the room shifted once more, the earlier judgment dissolving into something else entirely, something closer to discomfort, even embarrassment. And one by one, the phones that had been raised began to lower, the audience no longer certain what role they were playing in this unfolding moment. And the supervisor exhaled slowly, her tone changing as she turned back to Emily, softer now, more careful. "Ma'am, it appears everything is in order," she said, choosing each word deliberately, as if aware that the balance of the situation had tipped. And for the first time since it began, there was a trace of hesitation in her voice. And yet, even as the facts became clear, something else lingered in the air, something unresolved, because this was no longer just about a ticket or a seat number. It was about what had already been said, what had already been assumed. And as the silence stretched again, deeper this time, more reflective, a distant announcement echoed through the terminal. followed by a name that made the supervisor's expression change once more, not with doubt this time, but with something far more unsettling. And Emily Carter did not react. Not yet. But her eyes shifted slightly, just enough to suggest that she had been expecting this moment all along. The announcement echoed again, clearer this time, cutting cleanly through the thick silence that had settled over the first-class check-in area. "Attention, please. Welcoming CO Alexander Carter arriving at Terminal 4. And the words seemed to ripple outward, moving through the space like a quiet shockwave, because that was not a name people heard casually. Not here, not in this setting, and the supervisor's posture changed instantly, her shoulders straightening, her expression tightening into something far more alert, while the agent's eyes widened just slightly, recognition flashing across his face before he quickly tried to compose himself. And around them, the crowd shifted once more, but this time it was different. Not curiosity, not judgment, but awareness, the kind that comes when something important is about to happen. And Emily Carter remained still, her gaze steady, but there was a subtle change now, something almost imperceptible in the way she held herself, as if the moment everyone else was reacting to had already passed for her long before it arrived for them. And the supervisor cleared her throat softly, her tone carefully measured as she turned back to Emily. "We apologize for the inconvenience," she said, each word chosen with precision, as if trying to smooth over what could no longer be undone. But the apology hung awkwardly in the air, incomplete, insufficient, and the agent shifted his weight, his earlier confidence completely gone now, replaced with something closer to discomfort, even unease, and he avoided looking directly at Emily, focusing instead on the counter, on anything that would keep him from confronting what had just happened. And then, the sound of footsteps approached, slow, deliberate, unmistakably confident, the kind of footsteps that did not rush, did not hesitate, because they had never needed to, and one by one, heads began to turn, conversations faded, and the energy in the room shifted yet again. But this time it was immediate, undeniable, as a man in a perfectly tailored navy suit walked into view, his presence commanding attention. Without effort, his posture relaxed but assured, his expression calm, unreadable, and as he moved closer, the supervisor's face changed completely, her professional composure snapping into something sharper, more precise. "Sir," she said quickly, stepping forward slightly, her voice carrying a new level of respect that had not been there before, and the agent followed her lead, straightening, his entire demeanor transforming in an instant, and the man's gaze moved across the scene, taking in everything, the counter, the crowd, the tension that still lingered in the air, and then it stopped, resting on Emily. And in that moment, something shifted again, something quieter, but far more powerful, because the look he gave her was not one of curiosity, not one of surprise, but recognition, immediate and absolute. And Emily met his gaze with the same calm she had carried from the beginning. No change, no reaction. As if this was exactly how it was always meant to unfold, and the silence deepened, stretching just long enough for everyone present to feel it, to sense that whatever came next would not just resolve the moment, but redefine it entirely. And then, without raising his voice, without any trace of urgency, the man spoke, his tone steady, controlled, and unmistakably clear. "Is there a reason my wife is being treated this way?" And just like that, the entire room went completely silent. The silence did not break immediately. It deepened, stretching across the polished marble floor and up through the stunned faces of everyone watching. Because in that single sentence, everything had changed, not just the situation, but the meaning of every word that had been spoken before it. And the supervisor's composure faltered for the first time, her lips parting slightly as she tried to respond, but no words came out. And the agent froze mid-breath, his posture stiff, his earlier authority completely gone, replaced by a sudden and unmistakable realization that he had misjudged something far bigger than a passenger in the wrong line. And Alexander Carter did not raise his voice. He did not repeat himself. He simply stood there, his gaze steady, patient, waiting, and that patience carried more weight than any anger could have, because it made it clear that he already knew enough. And the supervisor quickly gathered herself, stepping forward with a forced professionalism that now felt fragile. "Sir, there has been a Misunderstanding, she said, her tone careful, respectful, very different from moments ago, and the shift was obvious to everyone. The contrast impossible to ignore, and Alexander's eyes did not leave hers as he asked, quietly, "What kind of misunderstanding requires my wife to be told she does not belong here?" And the words landed with precision, not loud, not aggressive, but exact. And the supervisor swallowed, her confidence slipping as she searched for an answer that would not make things worse. "We were verifying her ticket," she replied, choosing each word slowly. There was confusion regarding her access to the first-class area, and behind her, the agent nodded quickly, as if supporting the explanation, though his eyes remained fixed on the counter, avoiding both Emily and Alexander. And for a moment, the explanation hung in the air, thin and unconvincing. And Alexander glanced briefly at Emily, his expression softening just enough to acknowledge her, to confirm that she was all right. And she gave the slightest nod in return, calm as ever, before he turned his attention back to the staff. And when he spoke again, his tone remained even, but there was a clarity in it now, something sharper beneath the calm. "Her ticket was valid," he said, not as a question, but as a statement, and the supervisor nodded immediately. "Yes, sir, it is confirmed," she admitted. And that admission seemed to settle something final in the air, because now there was no confusion left, no uncertainty to hide behind. Only the truth of what had already happened, and the agent shifted again, his discomfort growing, the weight of the situation pressing in as the eyes of the crowd turned from curiosity to quiet judgment, no longer directed at Emily, but at him, and Alexander let the silence sit for a moment, long enough for everyone to feel it, to understand it, before he spoke once more. "Then this was not a misunderstanding," he said, his voice calm, controlled, but unmistakably firm, and the words landed like a quiet verdict, and the supervisor's expression tightened, because she knew he was right, and there was no easy way to deny it. And around them, the atmosphere had completely changed, the earlier laughter gone, replaced by something heavier, something reflective. And Emily Carter stood quietly beside him, her posture unchanged, her dignity intact, as if she had never been shaken at all. And in that moment, it became clear to everyone watching that the power in the room had shifted completely, not through volume, not through force, but through truth. And Alexander Carter took a small step forward, his presence filling the space without effort, as he prepared to say something that would not just address what had happened, but ensure it would never be forgotten. The weight of his words lingered in the air, not because they were loud, but because they were undeniable, and Alexander Carter did not rush to fill the silence. He let it breathe, let it settle over everyone present, because sometimes the most powerful moment is not what is said, but what is understood. And the supervisor lowered her gaze for a brief second, a subtle but telling shift, as if the reality of the situation had finally caught up with her, and the agent stood frozen beside her, his earlier confidence completely erased, replaced by the quiet discomfort of someone realizing that every assumption he had made was now visible to everyone around him. And the crowd, once entertained, once curious, had gone completely still, their attention no longer scattered but focused, unified, witnessing something far more significant than a simple misunderstanding at a check-in counter. And Alexander's voice came again, steady, controlled. "Do you train your staff to decide who belongs here based on appearance?" he asked, and the question was simple, direct, but it carried a weight that pressed down on the entire space, and the supervisor quickly shook her head. "No, sir, of course not," she replied, her tone careful, almost urgent now. "That is not our policy." And Alexander nodded slightly, acknowledging the response, but not accepting it, and his gaze shifted briefly toward the agent, who immediately looked down, unable to meet his eyes. And in that moment, no accusation was needed, no raised voice, because the truth was already clear, and Emily stood quietly beside him, her presence unchanged, her expression calm, but there was a quiet strength in her stillness that now felt unmistakable, as if everything that had just happened had only revealed what had always been there. And Alexander turned back to the supervisor, his tone unchanged, but firmer now. "Then your policy is not being followed," he said, and the statement landed with finality, leaving no room for interpretation, and the supervisor nodded again, this time more quickly. "You are absolutely right, sir," she admitted, her voice lower, more sincere. "This situation should have been handled differently." And for a moment, it seemed like that might be enough, that the acknowledgement itself could close the gap between what had happened and what should have happened. But Alexander did not move. He did not step away, because this was not about a single moment. It was about something deeper, something that extended beyond this beyond this terminal. And he let the silence return once more, not as tension, but as reflection, giving everyone present a chance to understand what had just been exposed. And in that silence, something shifted again, not in the staff, not in the crowd, but in the atmosphere itself, because what had started as a quiet act of judgment had now become a public lesson in something far more important. And Alexander finally spoke again, his voice softer now, but no less clear. "Respect is not something you offer based on what you see," he said, his eyes steady. "It is something you show because of who you are." And the words did not echo loudly, but they stayed, settling into the space like a truth that could not be ignored. And the supervisor nodded slowly, absorbing every word, while the agent remained still, the lesson landing without needing to be repeated. And Emily Carter stood there, unchanged, her dignity intact from the very beginning, as if she had never needed the moment to prove anything at all. And around them, the crowd remained silent, not because they were waiting for something else to happen, but because they had already seen everything they needed to understand. The silence did not break with noise. It shifted into something heavier, something reflective, as if the entire terminal had quietly agreed to pause and reconsider what had just unfolded. And the supervisor took a slow breath, her posture no longer rigid with authority but softened with awareness. "Mr. Carter," she began carefully, her voice steady but carrying a different kind of weight now. "On behalf of our team, I sincerely apologize to Mrs. Carter for how this situation was handled." And the words were formal, expected, but there was a subtle change in her tone that suggested this was no longer just procedure, it was recognition. And beside her, the agent finally looked up, his expression uncertain, conflicted, as if he was still processing the distance between what he had assumed and what was now undeniable. And for a moment, it seemed like he might speak, like he might try to explain or defend himself. But no words came, because there were no words that could bridge that gap. And Emily turned her gaze toward him briefly, not with anger, not with judgment, but with something quieter, something that made the moment even more difficult to escape. And then she looked away again, as if releasing him from the need to respond. And Alexander remained still, his presence calm but commanding, his attention focused not on the apology itself, but on what it represented. And he gave a slight nod, acknowledging it without extending the moment further, because this was not about prolonging discomfort, it was about understanding. And the supervisor quickly signaled to another staff member, who stepped forward with a new level of attentiveness, retrieving a fresh boarding pass holder, offering assistance with a respect that was now unmistakable. And the shift in behavior was immediate, visible to everyone watching, a contrast so sharp it did not need to be explained. And Emily accepted the boarding pass quietly, her movements unhurried, her composure unchanged, as if none of this had altered who she was, only revealed it more clearly. And around them, the crowd began to disperse slowly, conversations resuming in low tones, but the energy was different. Now, more subdued, more thoughtful, as if each person carried a small piece of what they had just witnessed with them. And the phones that had once been raised to capture a moment of embarrassment were now lowered. Some even slipped quietly back into pockets. The story no longer something to watch, but something to consider. And the agent stepped back slightly, giving space, his posture no longer defensive, no longer certain, but reflective, as if he had just learned something that could not be undone. And Alexander placed a gentle hand on Emily's shoulder, a small gesture, almost invisible, but filled with meaning, and she gave him a soft glance in return, not of relief, not of dependence, but of understanding, as if they both knew this moment was never about power, but about principle. And as they turned to move toward the boarding gate, the marble floor echoed once more beneath their steps, but now the sound carried a different weight, not of status, not of privilege, but of quiet dignity restored, and behind them, the supervisor remained still for a moment longer, watching them walk away, her expression thoughtful, changed, as if the lesson had reached deeper than policy, deeper than procedure, settling somewhere that would influence every decision that came after, and in the lingering silence that followed. One truth remained clear to everyone who had been there, that respect is not given to those who appear to deserve it, but to those who choose to give it regardless. As Emily and Alexander walked toward the gate, the tension behind them did not disappear. It transformed, settling into the space like a quiet echo that refused to fade. And though the crowd had begun to move again, there was a subtle difference in the way people carried themselves. Conversations softer, glances more thoughtful, as if something unseen had shifted within them. And near the counter, the agent remained still, his hands resting lightly on the edge of the marble, his eyes following the direction Emily had gone, not with resentment, but with a kind of quiet realization that lingered heavier than any reprimand could have. And the supervisor turned slightly toward him, her voice low, controlled. "We will talk about this later," she said, not harsh, not angry, but firm enough to signal that this moment would not simply be forgotten. And he nodded once, slowly, absorbing the weight of it. Because this was no longer about a mistake. It was about something deeper, something that would stay with him long after this shift ended. And across the terminal, Emily and Alexander moved through the crowd without drawing attention, their pace unhurried, their presence calm, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. And yet the quiet space that formed around them told a different story, because people noticed, even if they did not fully understand why. And a woman sitting near the gate lowered the magazine in her hands, watching them pass with a thoughtful expression, while a young man who had recorded earlier glanced down at his phone, hesitating before slowly locking the screen, as if reconsidering what he had captured. And Emily walked beside Alexander with the same steady composure she had carried from the beginning, her gaze forward, her posture relaxed, and after a few steps, she spoke softly. "You did not have to come down here," she said, her tone calm, not questioning, simply acknowledging. And Alexander gave a small, almost imperceptible smile, his voice just as quiet. "I was already on my way," he replied, and there was something in the simplicity of the exchange that revealed more than any explanation could, because it was not about rescuing her, it was about standing beside her. And Emily nodded slightly, understanding without needing further words, and as they approached the gate, the attendant there straightened immediately, her expression attentive, respectful, but this time not exaggerated, not forced, simply present in a way that felt genuine. "Welcome, Mrs. Carter," she said, her voice warm, and Emily returned a small nod, her expression unchanged, because respect, when it is real, does not need to be announced, it is felt. And behind them, far back at the check-in counter, the supervisor remained still for a moment longer before turning to address her team, her voice calm but purposeful, beginning a conversation that would likely reshape more than just one interaction. And the agent listened, not defensively, but quietly, the lesson settling deeper with each passing second, and the marble floors continued to echo with footsteps, the airport returning to its usual rhythm. But beneath that surface, something had shifted, something subtle but lasting. Because moments like this do not end when people walk away. They linger, they reshape perception. They challenge assumptions, and as Emily and Alexander stepped forward to board, the gate opened with a soft mechanical sound, and for a brief second, the space behind them fell into a quiet stillness once more, as if the world itself had paused just long enough to remember what dignity looks like when it stands its ground without ever needing to raise its voice. Inside the aircraft, the atmosphere felt different from the moment they stepped in, not because of luxury or space, but because of the quiet awareness that followed them like a shadow that had not yet settled. And the flight attendant at the entrance greeted them with a warm, composed smile, her posture straight, her tone respectful in a way that felt natural rather than performative. "Welcome aboard, Mr. and Mrs. Carter," she said, and Emily returned a small nod, her expression calm, her presence unchanged, as if the events of the past few minutes had already been filed away. Somewhere deeper, somewhere that did not need to be revisited to be understood. And as they moved down the aisle, the soft hum of the cabin wrapped around them. Muted conversations, the gentle rustle of newspapers, the low chime of overhead bins closing, all blending into a quiet rhythm that contrasted sharply with the tension they had just left behind, and they reached their seats, 2A and 2B, positioned by the window, where the city skyline stretched out in the distance, framed by the early afternoon light. And Emily placed her bag overhead with ease, settling into her seat with the same steady composure she had carried from the beginning. And Alexander took his place beside her, his movements calm, unhurried, as if nothing about the situation had required urgency. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that mattered had already been understood without words. And across the aisle, a passenger who had witnessed part of the scene earlier glanced over, then quickly looked away, as if unsure whether to acknowledge what had happened, and that uncertainty lingered in the air, subtle but present. And Emily turned slightly toward the window, her eyes following the slow movement of ground crews preparing the aircraft for departure, and after a few seconds, she spoke softly, her voice thoughtful. "It is interesting how quickly people decide who belongs," she said, not with bitterness, not with frustration, but with quiet reflection. And Alexander nodded once, his gaze steady. "It is easier to judge than to understand," he replied, his tone calm, and the simplicity of the exchange carried a weight that did not need elaboration. And a flight attendant approached with a tray of pre-departure drinks, offering them with a polite smile, her attention attentive but not intrusive, and Emily accepted a glass of water, thanking her softly. And as the attendant moved on, the cabin settled again into a gentle stillness, the kind that exists just before takeoff, when everything is in place but not yet in motion. And behind them, faintly, the distant echo of announcements from the terminal could still be heard, reminders of a space where assumptions had just been challenged. And though they were now separated from it by walls and distance, the impact of that moment remained, not loud, not dramatic, but present, shaping the quiet understanding between them. And as the aircraft doors closed with a soft, final sound, sealing the cabin from the outside world, Emily leaned back slightly in her seat, her expression peaceful, not because the situation had been resolved by someone else, but because she had never lost control of herself within it. And Alexander glanced at her briefly, a look of quiet respect passing between them, unspoken but clear. And outside, the runway stretched forward, endless and open, as the plane prepared to move, carrying them away from a moment that, for everyone else, might fade into memory, but for those who truly understood it, would remain as something far more lasting, a reminder that dignity does not need to be announced, it simply needs to be held. The aircraft began to move slowly, the gentle pushback signaling the start of departure, and the low hum of the engines deepened just enough to be felt beneath the calm surface of the cabin. And outside the window, the ground crew stepped back with practiced precision, their movements synchronized, routine, almost mechanical. And yet inside, the atmosphere remained thoughtful, as if the weight of what had happened still lingered quietly between breaths. And Emily watched the scene unfold beyond the glass, her reflection faintly visible against the fading light, her expression composed, unchanged, but there was a depth in her gaze now, something reflective, as if she were not just looking outward, but inward as well. And Alexander sat beside her, his posture relaxed, his hands resting lightly on the armrest, his presence steady, not imposing, not protective, simply present. And for a moment, the two of them shared the same silence, not empty, but full of understanding, the kind that does not require explanation. And across the aisle, the same passenger who had noticed them earlier glanced over once more, this time with a different expression, not curiosity, not uncertainty, but something closer to respect, as if the pieces of what had happened were finally settling into place. And a flight attendant moved quietly down the aisle, checking seat belts, offering small reassurances, her voice soft, measured, blending seamlessly into the rhythm of the cabin. And as she reached their row, she paused briefly, offering a polite nod, her tone warm. "Everything comfortable for you both?" she asked, and Emily returned a small smile. "Yes, thank you," she replied, her voice calm, and the attendant moved on, her professionalism consistent, unforced. And as the plane turned onto the runway, the engines grew louder, the vibration slightly stronger, a signal that forward motion was no longer optional, but inevitable, and Emily leaned back gently, her fingers resting lightly against the armrest, her breathing steady, as if grounding herself in the moment, and then, almost as if speaking to the space rather than to Alexander directly, she said, "It is not the first time." And the words were quiet, simple, but they carried a history that stretched beyond this single moment, and Alexander turned his head slightly, his expression attentive, not surprised, not questioning, because he already understood what she meant, and he nodded once, slowly. "I know," he said, and there was no need for more, because acknowledgement, when it is real, does not need to be expanded. And the aircraft began its acceleration, the runway blurring beneath them, the force pressing gently back into their seats as the world outside shifted from stillness to motion. And for a brief second, everything narrowed to that single moment of transition, when the ground releases and the sky takes over. And as the plane lifted, rising smoothly above the city, the terminal, the crowds, the check-in counter, all of it became smaller, distant, reduced to something that could no longer define the present. And yet the meaning of what had happened did not shrink with it. It remained, carried forward, not as a burden, but as a quiet clarity, and Emily closed her eyes for just a second, not in relief, not in exhaustion, but in calm, as if reaffirming something within herself that had never been shaken. And when she opened them again, the horizon stretched wide and open before her, endless and unjudging, and beside her, Alexander remained still, his presence unchanged, steady as ever. And in that shared silence above the clouds, it became clear that what mattered most had never been the moment itself, but the way it had been met, with composure, with dignity, with a quiet strength that did not need to be proven, because it had always been there. At cruising altitude, the world below had disappeared into a soft layer of clouds, leaving only light, silence, and the steady hum of the aircraft. And inside the cabin, everything felt suspended, not just in the air, but in time, as if the intensity of what had happened earlier had been gently set aside, not erased, but placed somewhere quieter, somewhere deeper. And Emily sat with her gaze forward, her posture relaxed, her hands resting calmly in her lap, and there was something about her stillness that made it clear she was not replaying the moment, not holding on to it, but understanding it, absorbing it in a way that did not disturb her peace. And across the aisle, the passenger who had noticed them before finally leaned slightly forward, hesitating for a moment before speaking softly. "Excuse me," he said, his voice careful, respectful, and Emily turned her head slightly, acknowledging him with a calm expression, and he offered a small, sincere smile. "I just wanted to say, you handled that with a lot of grace," he added, his words simple, but genuine, and Emily paused for a brief moment, not out of surprise, but consideration, before responding. "Thank you," she said quietly, and there was no pride in her tone, no need to expand on it, just acknowledgement, and the man nodded once, leaning back into his seat, the exchange complete, but its meaning lingering. And Alexander observed the moment without interruption, his expression thoughtful, because what had just happened was not about recognition. It was about reflection, the quiet transfer of understanding from one person to another. And as the cabin lights dimmed slightly, signaling the shift into a more relaxed phase of the flight, the atmosphere softened further, the earlier tension now replaced by something calmer, something more introspective, and Emily turned her attention back toward the window, where the sunlight stretched endlessly across the clouds, creating a horizon that felt both distant and immediate at the same time. And after a moment, she spoke again, her voice low, steady. "It is never really about the place," she said, and Alexander glanced at her, listening, and she continued, "It is about how people choose to see you before they know anything about you." And her words carried no bitterness, only clarity, and Alexander nodded slowly. "And sometimes," he added, "it is about how they choose to see themselves." And the thought settled between them, quiet but complete, because the moment at the airport had not just revealed one person's mistake. It had revealed something larger, something shared, something that extended beyond that single interaction. And as the flight continued, the cabin settled into a peaceful rhythm, passengers resting, reading, or simply looking out into the endless sky, and Emily leaned back slightly, her eyes soft, her expression calm, as if she had already moved beyond the need to hold on to anything that had happened. And in that quiet space above the world, where distance softened everything below, one truth remained. Not spoken, not emphasized, but understood, that dignity does not depend on recognition. It does not require validation. It exists quietly, steadily, within, waiting only for the moment when it is seen, not by others, but by those who choose to carry it without ever needing to prove it. Hours later, as the aircraft began its gradual descent, the soft chime echoed through the cabin, signaling the return to the world below, and passengers stirred gently from their quiet routines, seatbacks lifting, window shades adjusting, the rhythm of flight giving way to the anticipation of arrival. And Emily Carter opened her eyes slowly, her gaze drifting once more toward the horizon where the clouds parted to reveal the city beneath, sprawling, complex, filled with countless lives moving in their own quiet stories. And beside her, Alexander remained still, his presence unchanged, steady as it had been from the very beginning, and neither of them rushed to speak, because there was nothing left unresolved, nothing left unsettled. And as the plane descended, the details of the world grew sharper, streets forming patterns, buildings rising into view, everything becoming clearer, and in that clarity, there was something almost symbolic, as if perspective itself had shifted, not just in distance, but in understanding. And the cabin lights brightened slightly, and the flight attendant's voice came over the intercom, calm and practiced, welcoming them to their destination, thanking them for flying. And around them, passengers began gathering their belongings, quiet conversations resuming, but there was still a softness to it, a lingering awareness that had not fully faded. And across the aisle, the same passenger glanced toward Emily one last time, offering a small nod, not out of curiosity now, but recognition, and she returned it just as simply, because some acknowledgments do not need words. And as the wheels touched the runway with a gentle, controlled impact, the aircraft slowed, the motion steady, grounding them once again. And Emily exhaled softly, not out of relief, but completion, as if the journey, both physical and unspoken, had reached its natural end. And when the seatbelt sign turned off, people began to stand, reaching for their bags, moving with that familiar urgency to return to their lives. And Emily remained seated for a moment longer, unhurried, her hands resting calmly as she watched the movement around her. And then she stood, retrieving her carry-on with the same ease she had shown from the beginning. And Alexander followed beside her, and together they moved toward the exit, blending into the flow of passengers, not seeking attention, not drawing it, simply part of the movement forward. And as they stepped out of the aircraft and into the terminal, the sounds returned, footsteps, announcements, distant conversations, but none of it carried the weight it had before, because something had shifted, something internal, something lasting. And as they walked side by side, Emily glanced briefly at Alexander, a quiet understanding passing between them, not about what had happened, but about what it meant. And he gave a small nod in return, and they continued forward, their steps steady, their presence calm, and behind them, the world continued as it always does, unaware of the quiet lessons carried within moments like these. But for those who had witnessed it, and for those who had lived it, one truth remained, not spoken, not announced, but clear in its simplicity. That day, in a place built on movement and status, dignity did not arrive with wealth. It did not depend on recognition. It stood quietly, unwavering, and reminded everyone watching what it truly looks like when it is never compromised.